Good evening and welcome to the Harvard Kennedy School Student Policy Review Journal. I'm Kolkaila. I'm currently an MCMPA pursuing my mid-career master's in public administration at the Harvard Kennedy School. Prior to that, I'm an economist, and I used to serve as a civil servant at the Egyptian government with a background focusing on international cooperation and economic development. We're honored to have Dr. Omar Razzaz, a distinguished figure, a Jordanian, and in politics and academia. Dr. Omar Razzaz served as the former Prime Minister of Jordan for between 2018 to 2020. And it's such an honor to have you here and hear from you and your insights on Jordan and in the region. Welcome, Dr. Omar.
Thank you, Ala. Thank you for inviting me, and I really want to thank the Harvard Kennedy School Student Review for taking on the initiative of doing media with and for students that we can communicate directly. So I really appreciate that.
Such an honor. Dr. Omar, your career has spanned academia, public service, and political activism. What motivated you to join the public service?
I got my degrees outside Jordan, here at Harvard and at MIT. I worked in development in many countries, and there was something missing. I felt like if there's anything I can contribute back in my country, it would be so much more meaningful. Of course, I enjoyed working in other countries and stuff, but that pull back to be back home and trying to make a difference, I think was the determinant factor. So I went back and I was with Social Security. I headed the Social Security. Then I became the Minister of Education, and then eventually I became the Prime Minister. And between the Social Security and Education, I was involved in all sorts of things, and creating think tanks, being involved in all sorts of activities in the private sector, the public sector.
That's very interesting. So when you assumed office, Jordan was facing a multitude of issues, whether economic and social. My question for you would be how were you able to balance between the fiscal considerations and the social unrest that was there, given that there were protests mainly because of the tax reform policy that was introduced?
Yeah.
So,
definitely it was a hard entry into the political sphere because, as you said, there were protests against a new tax law that was an income tax law, and this was at a time when Jordanians were hurting. Unemployment was high, poverty was high, and et cetera, et cetera. So, but this was something that the IMF had required, and it gave us a deadline for. So on the one hand, I felt like we have to do something because otherwise Jordan's rating would fall, and the interest we pay on loans would increase substantially. And so what I tried to do is to say, okay, there wasn't enough dialogue on this law. Not enough people participated in understanding why and how and what should we do. So I pulled the law back from Parliament, and we created debate about it with the private sector, with youth, with startups, with export companies. And as we talked about it, we realized that there were things in the law that did not make sense, and we modified them and made the law sort of more more fitting of the Jordanian context. And the advantage of the law, and this is people didn't quite understand and recognize that it's a progressive law, in a sense, an income tax law. You're an economist, so you know. An income tax law is more progressive than a sales tax law, because a sales tax, you take the same amount from anybody regardless of whether they're rich or poor. The income tax law took more from the higher income and from companies, etc., that were not paying in income tax. So it was much more progressive, while the other one was regressive. But it's hard when you just come into government to be the first thing you talk about is income tax and tax in general. So it was my advice to you when you become prime minister, try to avoid taxation in the first 3 months. That really took a lot of work, and I think did affect the popularity of the government in the beginning.
But that's very interesting, because structural reforms, as you were saying, like the income tax here, it was a structural reform. It was introduced or like by the IMF. So usually structural reforms happens in a comprehensive manner. So you cannot look at one aspect without another. So you as a prime minister, and before that, like leading the education and the social security. So, and obviously like driving evidence-based policies with your background here from Harvard and MIT. So you had some sort of like more of a vision for what you had for the government. So
Absolutely.
What were the challenges you encountered? What was your vision, and what were the challenges, and how were you able to navigate that?
Very good question. So obviously, the kind of getting the economy moving is not about tweaking the tax structure. You needed to figure out where government bureaucracy is, where red tape is, what is the potential for private sector in certain sectors to move on. So the driving force on the economic front is how can we work with the private sector, small enterprises, medium enterprises, and large enterprises, to kind of help them grow and help them grow and increase hiring of Jordanian unemployed youth. And that was always an issue. Sometimes you had growth in Jordan, but hiring foreign workers in the country, which is fine if you don't have huge unemployment, but if you have unemployment. So we worked with specific sectors. We sat together with the tourism sector. We sat together with the health sector. We sat together with the garment industry and the agro industry. And with each, we had a package of reforms that would help them grow. And by the end of 2019, so this took about 3-4 months, we started seeing movement in the right direction and the private sector moving forward. But a few months later, COVID hit. So so that's on the economic front. And I can say, I don't know if you're
please.
Jordan always, because it's a resource-poor country in terms of natural resources, fossil fuels, knew that its capital is its citizens, its human beings. So how you invest, how you protect in individuals, how you invest in your labor force that is coming, and how you protect the labor force in cases of unemployment, provide health care, the right type of education, so that the supply of graduates meets the demand in the private sector. All of these needed a lot of work. And we spent a lot of time sort of expanding the kind of social safety net and our human resource policies so that they complement each other, especially when it comes to employment of women. We've had female participation in higher education was even higher than for males. So we had like 56%, almost 60% female as opposed to male. But when we looked at the labor market, female representation was very, very weak. In the public sector, they were about 40%, 45%. In the private sector, they were like 13 or 15%, very, very low. So obviously, this was an issue that needed to be addressed. And we started looking at, were we providing the right public transport? Because we asked them, what's keeping you? Public transport was an issue. If they were young women, married women, they had children, what are they gonna hire a housekeeper, pay her 300 JDs and work for 450 JDs and just make 100? So early childhood availability of that. So all of these things were complementary to create the kind of dynamic labor force and environment. But I have to acknowledge all of this stuff is a long-term strategy that provides goods. So the wrong approach to take is to say, okay, we need quick wins immediately. But we were trying to do that, but at the same time create the laws and regulations and build the type of services that will really help down the road.
Well, thank you for shedding the light on the resources and the labor, because I think it's very important when it comes to the context of Jordan. But also Jordan, with its strategic location in the Middle East, tends to receive a lot of refugees from its neighboring countries, whether it's from Iraq and from Syria. And I would assume this has put a lot of strain on Jordan's infrastructure and resources. So what's your stance in terms of balancing the humanitarian aid with the influx of the increase of refugees, which is definitely entails an increase on unemployment rate and labor force?
If you look at Jordan's his history and demographics, there's wave after wave of refugees, starting in 1948 from Palestinian refugees, 1967, and there were Lebanese refugees from the Civil War, there were Iraqi refugees from the war, then there was a big chunk of Syrian refugees, about 1.3 million coming. And Jordan is a diverse society, welcoming, especially because with the Syrians, there are actual families, relations across the border. So Jordan tends to do this with an open arm, and the king's directive, King Abdullah's directive, is that there should be no children left behind. We have to take care of education. We have to take care of health of the refugees, and this was a commitment. But at the same time, as you said, we're low on resources, very overcrowded schools, health services, labor market issues. And we started a dialogue with the EU, because refugees is when you have political refugees, what are the choices? You either build a wall, put a fence, prevent them from coming, or you absorb them. But it's almost a problem, increasingly so, of a global dimension. So, okay, Jordan is the neighbor next door that's willing to help, but is there no responsibility for the rest of the world? So the EU was willing to engage in that dialogue. So they did fund a good chunk of the costs of absorbing the refugees by supporting the government of Jordan. And the important thing there was that in the agreement was that also the extent to which the labor force, the way not to make sure that the Syrian workers aren't just competing with Jordanian workers, that they're complementing them with in areas in agriculture, in construction, and other industrial, and that we would have access to European market. We insisted on that because we know donors kind of are interested in the first year or two, and then but there's donor fatigue. There's a new crisis somewhere else, they turn their face, and then the country that's hosting country is left by itself to handle this. So we had longer term agreements, and there were pledges to meet those. In reality, the actual funding went down over time, and now it's not covering, and it hasn't been for a while covering the cost. That's an issue that needs to be dealt with at the level of the EU, the UN, as to what do you do with countries that do their job, open the doors for refugees. And this is going to be bigger and bigger over time because of climate change. Not all refugees are going to be political. Climate change is forcing all sorts of changes in livelihoods, and the heat waves and the droughts are forcing whole communities out of where they are. So there needs to be a global response that helps countries like Jordan help the refugees get on their feet, and as soon as possible go back to their countries, because that's what they want. They want to go back to their areas. In the case of Syrians, and you want to try to avoid the global and climate changes that create such dire circumstances.
Yeah, that's very important, and I think the situation is aggravated with what's happening now with the Palestinians and the Israeli war, given Jordan is a neighbor. And I can see like that there's a trend, like you took it to 18 to 19, COVID happened, and then you were handling COVID, now the Israeli war has happened on your borders. What's your outlook for Jordan from your economic outlook? What's Jordan economic outlook, and what are the challenges economically, and what's your advice for current policymakers?
Well, we have economic concerns, of course, and I'll talk a little bit about them. But our biggest concern is actually what's happening in Gaza and the West Bank. I mean, the utter Israeli kind of ignoring the calls, ignoring the Security Council resolution that came up just a few days ago, completely ignoring it, continuing the killing of innocent civilians. There are like 32,000 killed by now, and 74,000 injured. So the human dimension is just jarring and horrific for people around the world. So let alone Jordan, who's not right next door, yes, there are economic issues that are affecting us, but I think from the whole society is just sad, frustrated, and angered by what it sees, and wants to see a ceasefire and eventually the Palestinians getting their rights, the rights to determine their future in a two-state solution where they that live in peace with each other. But you asked the right question about the economy. I'll turn to that now. Of course, the biggest sector, which contributes about 12-13% to GDP, is tourism. Tourism is gone, practically. I mean, there's tourism by Jordanians, and so but in a net sense, tourism is gone. So we had been recovering before this started. So there was the COVID, then there was the Ukraine war later, and all of this affected Jordan as it affected anywhere else. And we were just starting to grow, and tourism was really booming. Exports, Jordanian exports to the EU were booming, etc. When October 7th happened, and we're still witnessing the consequences, and we don't know when and how it'll end.
Yeah. Well, what do you foresee Jordan's role in this regional stability to promote peace and help the cause?
Well, Jordan, let me go back historically with conflicts in the region. I mean, it's a neighborhood that's full of conflicts, as we know. And Jordan always preferred, in terms of conflicts amongst Arab countries, within Arab countries, take Syria, for example. Jordan always believed that there ought to be a political solution to the conflict in Syria. And the government, the opposition need to find a way to sit with each other and resolve some of that and come to a conclusion. This has been Jordan's attitude about Syria, about Iraq, about all conflicts in the region that Jordan felt just weakened the region altogether. So Jordan has always played that role. Now, Jordan was also signed the peace treaty with Israel in the hope that there would be a two-state solution, that there would be peace in the region, that would bring prosperity to all. But Jordan never believed that just focusing on the economy and kind of getting trade with countries in the region, etc., in itself is gonna bring peace. And of course, what happened in the last 7 months is proof of that. That unless you tackle the issue of Palestinians' legitimate rights for a state of their own where they can feel free and they can feel like citizens, you can't just shove that away and say, okay, we'll bring economic development in the region. So Jordan has been sort of I'd say careful and not that interested in some of the accords that were that preceded, that sort of assumed that we can open up and live happily ever after. And the events of October 7th came to prove that. And so our hope so we're working, Jordan's doing everything it can on the humanitarian relief front, but on the political front, it's emphasizing the tremendous importance of keeping the political rights of Palestinians at the center of debate and resolution going forward. And then, yes, inshallah, economic prosperity will come through, but not the other way around.
Yeah, regional stability is definitely very needed for economic prosperity. And my last question, Dr. Razzaz, as a Middle Eastern, we all look up to you for given that you're here at the Harvard Kennedy School, and as this interview is for the Harvard students, what advice would you leave to us before you leave?
Harvard is an amazing place to receive an education. It's a privilege. And when one leaves, when you say I'm a graduate of Harvard, people will be impressed by that. So it's fine to enjoy that privilege, but there is a huge responsibility by graduates of Harvard, especially coming from developing countries, from the Arab world where we're still suffering there. We have a duty to go back and try our best to implement the knowledge and education we've had in our part of the world, because it just doesn't, it's not fair, it doesn't make sense that our societies continue to suffer civil wars, conflicts, all of that stuff. In many of our countries in the region, it's affecting education, it's affecting reading and writing. There are kids in many countries in the region that are finishing high school and not learning how to read and write. So we have a huge responsibility, because we had the privilege, to try our best to make a difference, and I think we can, and it's a promising future for our part of the world.
Thank you, Dr. Omar. It's such an honor to meet you, and such an honor to have you here. And thank you, everyone.